What is going on, guys? Jim here and welcome back to the channel. If you've been following along at all, you've noticed we have spent a ton of time souping up or modifying our V8 chassis WRX. Although I've had a great time putting all of this really cool handling and aesthetic style stuff onto the vehicle, it hit me like a ton of bricks the other day. I have been spending all of my money in all of the wrong places. Dang. On today's video, we are going to be righting my wrongs and breathing new life back into our 2020 Subaru WRX. I've done it again. I have fallen victim to the game. I have spent all kinds of money on wheels and coilovers and titanium exhausts and all kinds of cool stuff, to try to soup up my scene points and make sure everybody gets to see me and know who I am when I'm driving around, and I broke the cardinal rule. None of this stuff is any good whatsoever if the car doesn't run or drive. If it's just sitting in my driveway, it is just a big turd. So today we are going to be changing the oil, transmission fluid, and rear diff fluid and get this car back on the road and return it to its former glory. So let's take a look at what kind of fluids we're going to be putting in the car. So here we are. We have our Motul 8100 Xclean EFE. We will explain more about the EFE in just a minute, but we'll go over all of the rest of the fluids. Oh yeah, and we have our OEM filter and crush washer in there. We have our Gear 300 Motul for the transmission and 90 PA for the rear diff. This gear fluid is a solid choice for any WRX, but I will tell you, because I live in Florida, the cold weather ratings of actually running a little bit thicker in our transmission and in our rear diff isn't going to affect me at all. If you're worried for any reason that if you live in Michigan or up northeast or anything like that, you might want to stick with more of an OEM style fluid thickness. But for me in Florida, knowing that I'm going to be driving the car relatively hard, this is the absolute perfect choice. So let's talk a little bit more about the oil. For those of you who don't know me, I have a long history in Subaru performance and mechanics. I worked at a company called IAG for a decade, and what I did there was their in-house performance and engine builds. And what that means is if you ever brought your car to IAG to have an engine put in, turbo and fueling put onto the car, and strap that car onto the dyno, there was a very good chance that I'm the guy who did it. Long story short, I've torn apart probably thousands of FA and EJ engines at this time. So oil choice is very important to me. And what's more important is choosing the right oil for your FA engine. And that's why we have the 8100 Xclean EFE. That means there's specific detergents that you won't find in the regular 8100 Xclean for your direct injection engine. In my history of tearing these cars apart, even if you do regular oil service and maintenance on these vehicles, once you start tearing the engine apart, there are some telltale signs that you're not using the proper oil. Once we tear the pan off and the heads off of the short block, everything can look good even if you did all of your scheduled maintenance. It's not until we start trying to pull the pistons out of the cylinders do we find a problem. Once you remove the piston from the cylinder, you can tell almost immediately that there's carbon buildup between your compression rings and your oil ring, even if the cylinder walls are in good shape. And that's because the direct injection engines require special detergents to break down that carbon buildup in between the rings. Long story short, even if you do your regular maintenance intervals, if you're not using the proper oil for your proper engine, you can still have a tremendous amount of blow-by in time. Luckily for us, and for you, we now know that information, and I highly recommend the EFE Xclean from Motul. That's enough for our little lesson today. We're going to get the car in, get it up onto the ramps and the jack stands, and we're going to start with the engine oil and the transmission fluid. The car is secured on the jack stands and the ramps with the e-brake engaged. Now the next step may come as a shock to you, but I'm actually going to remove the intercooler. Check it out. There you have it. Our intercooler is removed. Now you're probably going to ask me, with this particular service, why did I remove the intercooler? I mean, we can drain the oil and we can fill it from here. Although we can reach the dipstick much easier, you can fill it with a fluid transfer pump from underneath the car, so there was no real reason to remove the intercooler for the transmission fluid, but we are here to learn more than that. So let's go ahead and take a look at the intercooler. Since this car has 20,000 miles on it, and it's my first real experience looking at the maintenance, I can learn a lot by what I see by removing this intercooler. As we can tell, with 20,000 miles on it, there is absolutely no oil buildup inside the intercooler. Nice and clean. So what that tells me is, for the most part, this car was probably well taken care of before I got it. We're not worried too much about turbo oil blow-by or somebody overfilling the oil so that we have a whole bunch left over in our intercooler and our intake manifold. So we're learning about the car while we're doing the maintenance. The next thing touches on that transmission dipstick again. Although you can use a fluid transfer pump and get to it from underneath, I also like to check the fluid level prior to actually, draining it all to make sure we had the right amount of fluid in it when we took it out. Also, I think it's tremendously easier just to remove the intercooler and fill it with a funnel, and I get a lot more of my fluid to enter the actual transmission instead of being caught up in a fluid transfer pump. For example, if you take 4 quarts and you use a fluid transfer pump, you might lose close to a quarter or 0.3 of that fluid inside the pump, the lines, all that kind of good stuff. At this point, I can just put a funnel into it and make sure that if I put 3.5 quarts, I'm getting 3.5 quarts into the transmission. Our dipstick is at the full mark, which is another great indication that this car was very well maintained. Now that we know we have all the good fluid level in it, let's drain all of our fluids. Another good piece of information for you is to make sure we drain our filter first. Removing the filter is going to make sure that there's no suction built up here, so when we drain the oil and then put the drain plug back in, that we don't then loosen the filter and you have some oil that just at that point in time ends up back into the pan. So we've removed the filter, we've removed our cap, we've cleaned our bowl here, which is always good practice just to make sure we don't get any sort of contamination in there. Plus, having stuff clean, that's just, man, that looks good, Who wouldn't want that clean? Let's drain the oil. I've been doing this a long time, so I know you're not going to appreciate it as much as I do. But knowing to have a splash pan and a deep bucket is going to save you from getting splatter all over your driveway or your garage or wherever you're at. So that is how a professional does it on his back with almost zero mess. Oh yeah. There's one other thing we haven't talked about yet, including cleanliness. As you can see, there is a fluid transfer pump on the ground right here. We're going to be using that later to transfer all of our gear fluid and our oil out of our bucket back into all of the containers that we had so that there is zero mess. While all of our oil is draining out of the pan, we're going to go ahead and remove our old crush washer, which in this particular case seems to be some janky old plastic one, which is definitely not factory, and I don't recommend it. What I do recommend is replacing it with a factory crush washer. Now this is a one-time use washer. We're going to torque this down at the end to 30 foot-pounds, and what that is going to do is compress these 2 pieces of aluminum to a nice solid seal. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with this, you'll notice that there is a flat side of the washer and a round side of the washer. You're going to want to put the flat side of the washer down onto your drain plug like that. It's that simple. We've let it drain for about 15 minutes now. I think that's pretty good to get all of our oil out of the car. So once again, we're going to reinstall our drain plug and torque it to 30 foot-pounds. Since we're under here, we might as well start draining the transmission. Now that is going to take a T70 Torx, which is probably the only specialty tool you would need to complete this job. So if you're looking for one of those, we'll definitely drop a link in the description. We're back at the table to show you what you might find when you drain your transmission plug. As you can see, there's a fine buildup of gear material on top of our plug. Now that's for a few reasons. Number one, this is a magnetic drain plug, so anything that kind of gets sloshed around inside the transmission hopefully will end up attached to your drain plug. Secondly, no matter what kind of fluid you use in there, this is metal to metal contact for the gearing. So you are going to have some sort of shaving between the lash that's going to create this kind of metallic material. What we're not looking for is big chunks of stuff in there. So where I think this is 100% completely acceptable. In fact, I'm extremely happy with what I see here. This tells me that this car wasn't dogged prior to me going out and dogging it. Actually, is even a better example because I just thought about it. Here are some pieces of gear that came out of a different vehicle that we were maintaining. But it does go to show you the difference between an acceptable drain plug and what you don't want to see come out of your drain plug. Yep. Our fluid is almost done draining, so we are going to clean all of the metallic material off of our magnetic drain plug. Then we are going to reinsert and torque that drain plug back down. There you have it, all cleaned up. Here, I just want to show you guys this again. That is proof that on the ground with jacks and jack stands, you can do this job without any mess. Show that to your wife or girlfriend. This is a great time just to show you with the right tools and the right amount of effort, you can do all of this maintenance stuff yourself. You do not have to spend big bucks taking it to a shop because you're not confident. All it takes is a little bit of prepping, some tools, and man, you guys are going to save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in the future. Before I get too excited, I haven't done the rear yet, so maybe I shouldn't be celebrating, before the goal line. It also reminds me that I haven't put any fluid in the car yet, so anything could go wrong there. But let's start with putting the oil filter back on. We'll fill the engine up with oil, then we're going to move to the transmission, which we will fill up with our Gear 300. Then we'll move to the rear of the car and start our rear diff. Another word of the wise, if you are using factory OEM Subaru filters, remember that they do have this plastic cover over here, so don't just go screwing it on without forgetting to take your cap off. Got that nice and on there. Also, something else that's worth its weight in gold is proper funneling. As you can see, I have an oil funnel here that screws into our cap so that there's minimizing mess. Also for our transmission fill, we have a long neck funnel that allows me to dump the fluid all the way up here without worrying about getting all over the transmission or the garage floor. Another cool little trick for draining the oil into the car, if you pull the dipstick, you won't have that pressure build up inside the engine, which will allow the funnel to drain into the motor a lot quicker. Our engine and transmission fluids are in. As far as the oil capacity, we're at about 5.5 quarts. And for our non-STI WRX 6-speed, we're at about 3.8 liters of gear fluid. The next thing we're going to do, which is a highly overlooked step, is to flat foot crank or prime the motor before firing after any sort of oil change. This is going to help prevent kind of dry firing the engine. I know that there's still oil in the oil pump, but it is always good practice to prime your motor before any sort of fluid drain, then refill. Our oil cap is back on, everything is tight underneath the hood, so to perform our flat foot crank, we're first going to need to get inside the vehicle. To perform our flat foot crank in a manual Subaru vehicle, you're going to push and hold the clutch pedal all the way down while you push and hold the gas pedal all the way down, then attempt to start the car. At that point in time, the car is going to try to turn over, but it's not going to fire the injectors in the car, keeping the car from starting up. We're going to run that key cycle between 7 and 10 seconds to properly get oil up the pickup to the pump prior to starting. Another indicator that the car is properly primed is when you look on your gauge cluster, you will notice that your low oil pressure light will disappear. At that point in time, the car is making enough oil pressure to fire safely. Take your foot off the gas pedal and start the car as normal. At this point, let the car run for about 10 or 15 seconds, then we can check the stick for a proper oil level. I just topped off the oil level and everything is looking great. You're always going to want to make sure if you're under the hood to go ahead and check all of your other fluids while we're here. Make sure that our coolant and our overflow is topped off, your washer fluid, any of the basics for just getting around downtown. Finally, we're going to make it to the rear of the car where we're going to drain and fill our rear differential. Now, this is something that I highly recommend you do for all of these things, but unfortunately, I'm just kind of getting around to telling it to you now. Always, always, always be sure to remove your fill before you remove your drain. And this is so you don't go ahead and for things like the rear differential, you go ahead and drain the rear diff, and then there's a problem with your filler neck. A lot of times these things can cross thread over time or with corrosion or just backing into things or whatever the case may be, you might end up damaging the thread. So you will drain all of the fluid out and then be really hard pressed to get fluid back in the vehicle. So before we drain our rear differential, we're gonna make sure that we can get our filler out. Got our filler plug out. Now it's time for the drain. Just like our transmission plug, our drain plug for the rear diff also is magnetic. So you will see this kind of buildup of a little bit of just shaven gear material, but no healthy chunks. So we're going to go ahead and just clean this off and reinstall it. Our rear diff fluid is now complete. Nothing too bad, nothing to write home about. It's as simple as draining the fluid, put the plug back in, and then fill it up until it starts coming out the fill hole. And then once it stops coming out the fill hole, you torque both plugs down. At this point, I would call this job pretty much done. The last thing we have to do is get the car off of the ramps and the stands. Then we can take it around the neighborhood and, see if we feel any horsepower differences from all of our maintenance. I do doubt that we will feel any difference in the butt dyno, but it does go to show you that learning a lot about your car isn't that difficult. If you do the maintenance yourself, you know what your car is trying to tell you. And what we learned today is that even though the car has 20,000 miles on it, it looks like it's been taken pretty good care of. Another side note, I hope you took something from this video. Kind of like it's not that hard to do. I think you guys can do this kind of stuff. For the amount of money you would pay just for an oil change, for somebody, the labor to do that job, you could buy all of the tools needed to start doing your own service work on the vehicle. And all in all, it really isn't that difficult, especially if I can do it in the garage without dropping a single drip. I do believe in you. I have all the confidence in the world. But let's get this thing off the stands and take it for a drive. The last common thing for people to forget is to reset all of your maintenance reminders. So if we go into our center dash, go down to our enter screen, which is right here, press and hold enter. We can set our time and date, display, screen settings, all that. But if we keep scrolling down, we run into one called maintenance, believe it or not. And we can set our maintenance schedule, everything from our engine oil to our filters, tires, things like that. The great thing about that is that you can change your oil, life, filter, tire settings to your liking. So if you want to do it every 3,000 miles, you can set it on the dash. If you want to do it every 5,000 miles, you can set it on the dash. It doesn't just reset to a factory standard maintenance schedule. You have the ability to pick the mileage which suits you best. Oh wow, it even feels faster. Nah, just kidding. Exactly the same. I'm back from the test drive and I finally feel much better about what we've done to the vehicle today. I can get back on my mission of just spending stupid amounts of money on aesthetic mods and performance stuff instead of maintaining the vehicle, right? It's always good practice to maintain your vehicle, make sure they're running and driving, make sure they're properly fed so that you can enjoy the car on and off the street. The last thing we have to discuss today is what are we going to do with all of this oil and fluid that we've accumulated for our maintenance. That's where that fluid transfer pump I showed you earlier comes into play. Instead of trying to dump all of that fluid into those little tiny holes on the container, we can use our fluid transfer pump to stick into our container and then transfer all of the fluid back into our now empty containers. Once you've put your fluids back into those bottles, most like AutoZones or O'Reilly's or Advanced Auto Parts take used oil. So we could just put the caps on, put it in a nice box, and then return it to a local auto parts store and just get rid of the mess. All in all, I'm super happy, the car is super healthy, and that is all I could really ask for. The big question is, what do you guys think I should do to it next? I actually have a really good idea of what I'm going to do to it, but I want to see what you think. So drop a comment below. What do you think I'm going to do to this thing next? Either way, you know I'm going to get it from the one and only Import Image Racing, so for thousands of parts just like everything we did today, be sure to hit up importimageracing.com for all of the best deals on the web and in the world, and we'll catch you on the next one.